When we think about problems in schools, bullying, school victimization, it often seems straightforward. But it's actually a really complex global issue.
It really is.
And it has this huge negative impact on kids' well-being. And, well, despite lots of effort, it's still a persistent problem everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
So today, we're doing a deep dive. We're looking at a huge study. 77 countries, almost 600,000 teenagers, to really try and get under the skin of what's going on.
That's right. And the goal here isn't just, a simple definition. We want to explore the different forms of peer victimization.
Different forms.
Yeah, and how those different ways kids experience it really affect them across the globe. The research we're using today, it gives this really detailed picture, and it challenges some common ideas.
Okay, so the main source we're diving into is this 2023 review article. It's called Peer Victimization, an Integrative Review and Cross-National Test of a Tripartite Model. Quite a title.
It is, but it gets to the heart of it. It looks at different ways researchers have tried to model victimization. Is it just one thing?
Like one general score.
Exactly. Or maybe two components. Or, as this study suggests, maybe three distinct types. And then, crucially, it tests these ideas with all that data.
Okay, so walking away from this deep dive, listeners should get a better handle on, well, first, the different ways kids actually experience victimization, right? It's not just physical stuff.
Definitely not. And second, how these different types connect to things like gender and, really importantly, to a teenager's well-being, their mental health.
And this is pretty cool. We're going to see if our understanding, if these models actually work across different cultures, different countries.
Plus, there's this kind of surprising link between being victimized and how kids actually feel about bullying itself.
Yeah, that sounds paradoxical.
It does. And exploring that might give us some clues about why some current anti-bullying strategies, well, they might not be hitting the mark quite as well as we hope.
So this isn't just stats. It's about understanding the social world kids navigate, the real challenges. Hopefully valuable stuff for anyone interested in education, psychology, or just, understanding young people better.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's dig in.
Right. So the study kicks off talking about unidimensionality. What's that about in this context?
Well, it means that traditionally, a lot of research, and therefore a lot of the interventions, they tend to treat victimization as just one single thing.
Like it's all the same kind of bad experience?
Sort of, yeah, like just saying someone feels bad without knowing why or how. The study argues this really oversimplifies things.
Okay, and that simplification, it hinders our understanding, makes interventions less effective.
Precisely. It stops us seeing the important details. And if you don't see the details, how can you target your help effectively?
Makes sense. Does the study give an example of this, like how we measure it?
Yes. They mention a very common questionnaire, the Revised Always Bully Victim Questionnaire, the ROBVQ. You see it used a lot.
Right. And while it asks about different types of victimization, physical, verbal, social exclusion, that kind of thing, it often just boils it all down to one single global score. How victimized is this student overall?
So the specific information about how they were victimized gets lost in the average.
Exactly. And the study's point is that these different components, let's call them relational, verbal, and physical, they might have different causes, different triggers, and importantly, different consequences for the kid.
And a single score just mushes all that together.
It does. You miss those crucial distinctions.
Okay, so if treating it as one thing isn't ideal, what's the alternative? This is where the tripartite model comes in, I guess.
That's the core idea here. The study champions this three-component model.
Three components being?
Relational victimization, think social exclusion, rumors, gossip. Then verbal victimization, name-calling, insults, mockery. And finally, physical victimization, hitting, pushing, threats, that sort of thing.
Okay, so breaking it down into those three specific kinds of harm.
Yes, and they contrast this with another approach sometimes used, the bivariate model.
Bivariate.
Right. That model often lumps verbal and physical together as overt victimization and then compares that to relational.
So the big difference is whether you treat name-calling as more like hitting or more like social exclusion or as its own thing.
That's a really good way to put it. Is verbal its own category? And this study argues strongly that keeping verbal separate, the tripartite model, actually fits better with how we understand bullying behavior itself and also with broader research on aggression.
That feels more intuitive somehow. The words feel different from the punches, which feel different from being shut out by your friends.
Exactly. And look, To really see these different types clearly, you need good measurement tools. That sounds obvious, maybe.
But it's not always easy.
Right. The study points out this is a bit of weakness. The surveys we use matter hugely.
So how we ask the questions determines how clearly we see the different types of problems.
Absolutely critical. They mention some specific tools, like the Adolescent Peer Relations Instrument, APRI, the Student Survey of Bullying Behavior, the Delaware Bullying Victimization Scale, DBVS. When studies use instruments like these, designed to capture these nuances.
They can reliably identify the three types: relational, verbal, physical.
Yes, it shows these distinctions are real, measurable things if you use the right tools.
So it's not that they don't exist, it's that sometimes the lens we use isn't sharp enough.
Well put. And this particular study uses a statistical technique called exploratory structural equation modeling, or EC.
ECMM, okay.
And they argue it's better than the more common method, confirmatory factor analysis, CFA, for teasing these components apart.
Why is ECM better for this? Sounds technical.
Well, the key thing is EC allows for cross-loadings.
Cross-loading.
Yeah, think of it like this. A traditional analysis, CFA, usually assumes a survey question measures only one type of victimization. Like a question about being hit only measures physical. But reality is messier, right? An item like "I was laughed at" might tap into both verbal and relational victimization. ECM can handle that overlap.
Ah, so it reflects reality better. That an experience might have layers.
Exactly. It gives a more realistic, nuanced picture.
Yeah.
CFA often forces things into neat boxes that might not quite fit. ECM is more flexible.
Got it. So a more sophisticated way to look at the data.
Precisely. And armed with this ECM approach, the researchers did something pretty massive. They tested the different models, the one-component, two-component, and their preferred three-component ECM model.
Using that huge PISA 2018 data set, the 77 countries, almost 600,000 kids.
That's the one. The scale is just incredible. And the finding was really consistent across all these different places.
What did they find?
The three-component ECM model just fit the data best. It provided the clearest separation between relational, verbal, and physical victimization.
Wow. So that suggests this three-part view isn't just, a Western idea, but might actually be relevant much more broadly.
That's a strong implication, yes. Okay, so now we've kind of established that these three components seem to be a useful way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
The study then looks at how these different types relate to other things,
Mm-hmm.
like gender. What do they find there?
Right. Did boys and girls experience these differently?
Yes. And this is where looking at the components separately really shows its value. Across the board, boys reported more physical victimization.
Okay. Maybe not too surprising.
Perhaps not. And also, boys reported slightly more verbal victimization, but the difference was smaller there.
Interesting. What about relational, the social exclusion rumors?
This is the kicker. For relational victimization, the gender differences were negligible. Basically, boys and girls reported experiencing it at very similar levels.
Really? That is surprising. So if you only looked at an overall score...
You'd miss that completely. You might think boys are victimized more overall because of the physical aspect, but you wouldn't see that girls are potentially facing just as much harm when it comes to their social relationships.
That's a huge insight. It makes you think about interventions, doesn't it? Maybe we need different approaches depending on the type of harm, and maybe even gender.
Absolutely. A one-size-fits-all approach likely misses the mark for many students. It really highlights how lumping everything together obscures critical details.
Yeah, definitely. Makes you wonder if maybe we focus too much on the visible stuff, the physical, and not enough on the relational dynamics, which seem just as common for girls.
That's a very important question this raises. Now, closely related is how these different types link to well-being, how kids are actually doing.
Okay, the impact on them. What did the study find?
Well, they looked at various indicators, negative things like feeling scared or sad, but also positive ones like life satisfaction, sense of belonging at school.
Oh, what was the connection?
This was another really striking finding, maybe even counterintuitive for some. Relational and verbal victimization showed stronger links to lower well-being across almost all indicators compared to physical victimization.
Wait, stronger than physical. So being excluded or mocked was linked more strongly to feeling bad than being hit.
Yes. For example, that sense of belonging at school, it was most negatively impacted by relational victimization. Feeling like you don't belong seems incredibly damaging.
Wow. That really flips the script on the common idea that physical bullying is always the worst kind.
It does. Parents, teachers, even kids might see a bruise and think that's the most serious thing. But this huge study suggests let's say, the invisible wounds of social and verbal harm might actually cut deeper in terms of overall well-being.
That has massive implications for where we should focus support, doesn't it?
Huge implications. Maybe we need to pay much more attention to fostering positive social environments and tackling verbal aggression, not just stopping the pushing and shoving.
It really makes you reconsider policy priorities, intervention designs. Are we putting enough emphasis on the relational side?
It certainly pushes us to ask that. Now, speaking of surprising findings, let's talk about what the study calls the pro-bully paradox.
Right, I remember reading this section. It seemed really odd. What is it?
Okay, so the finding is this. The students who reported experiencing more physical victimization tended to have weaker anti-bullying attitudes.
Weaker anti-bullying attitudes. So
Yeah.
they were more likely to think bullying is okay or less wrong.
Essentially, yes. More likely to agree with statements supporting or excusing bullying behavior. It seems completely backwards.
Totally backwards. You'd think being a victim would make you the most anti-bullying person.
Logically, yes. But the data show this link, and importantly, it was mainly specific to physical victimization. They didn't find the same strong connection for relational or verbal victimization.
So specifically, kids who get hit or pushed are somehow less likely to condemn bullying. Why? That's baffling.
It is puzzling.
Yeah.
The study mentions a theory from earlier research. It suggests that maybe, as a kind of coping mechanism, victims of physical bullying might start to identify more with the aggressors, perhaps linked to lower self-esteem, feeling powerless, what psychologists call an external locus of control.
Sort of like, if you can't beat them, join them mentally. Or maybe trying to adopt that perceived toughness.
That could be part of it. It's a complex psychological reaction.
Hmm.
But the key thing is, this paradox wasn't just a blip in one country.
No.
No, this study found it replicated across many of the 77 countries. That really underscores that it's likely a real, widespread phenomenon.
That is deeply concerning. It means that experience doesn't automatically translate to empathy. For some kids, physical victimization might actually warp their view of the behavior itself.
It certainly suggests a more complicated picture than we might assume. Okay, now shifting gears slightly. The study also used this massive data set to compare victimization levels between different groups of countries. They looked at OECD versus non-OECD nations.
Right. Developed economies versus others? What were the differences?
Generally, they found levels of physical and relational victimization were higher in non-OECD countries.
Okay. What about verbal?
Interestingly, verbal victimization showed only marginal differences between the two groups. Maybe name-calling is just universally common.
Huh. So again, the type of victimization matters when making these big comparisons.
Absolutely. And it gets even more complex. They found gender differences also varied. For instance, in OECD countries, girls reported slightly more relational victimization. But in non-OECD countries, boys reported more relational victimization.
Wow. So the pattern of who experiences what type of harm can differ quite a bit depending on the broader context. Another reason not to use a single overall measure, I guess.
Exactly. And the researchers didn't just stop at OECD, non-OECD. They looked at a more specific measure, the Human Development Index, HDI.
Right, a measure of health, education, income.
Yes. And they found that higher HDI was linked to lower levels of physical and relational victimization.
So more developed countries tended to have less of those types.
Yes, and also stronger anti-bullying attitudes overall. But again, interestingly, verbal victimization didn't show that same strong link with HDI.
Verbal seems to be its own beast in some ways.
It does seem less tied to these macro-level development indicators. They also briefly mentioned links with things like country-level corruption, peace, cultural values like power distance or individualism, suggesting it's all part of a really complex web of societal factors.
Yeah, it's definitely not just happening in a vacuum inside the school walls. It reflects the wider society.
Now, one final area the study tackled, and one people are always interested in, anti-bullying policies. Do national policies actually make a difference?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What did they find?
Well, this was probably one of the most, let's say, sobering findings. The mere presence of a national-level anti-bullying policy, as reported by the OECD, was not significantly related to lower levels of victimization reported by students in those countries.
Wait, really? Having a policy didn't correlate with less victimization? That's surprising and disappointing.
It is surprising. You'd hope and expect policies would lead to reductions. However, they did find that countries with policies did tend to have stronger anti-bullying attitudes among students.
Okay, so policies might change how kids think about bullying, whether they see it as wrong.
But not necessarily change whether they actually experience it less.
That seems to be the implication from this large data set.
Yeah, so just having a policy on the books isn't the magic bullet.
So what does make the difference then?
The authors suggest it probably comes down to the specifics of the policy. What does it actually say? And, maybe even more crucially, how well it's implemented on the ground.
Right. In the schools, in the classrooms, does it translate into actual changes in behavior and environment?
Exactly. A national framework seems insufficient on its own. It's the local action, the school culture, the consistent application that likely matters most.
That's a really critical point. Policy is one thing, practice is another. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the biggest takeaways here? It feels like a lot to process.
I think the main message is loud and clear. We have to move past thinking about peer victimization as just one monolithic thing.
Yeah.
This study, with its incredible scope, gives really strong evidence that we need to understand those distinct forms: relational, verbal, and physical. They're different.
And they relate differently to gender, to well-being, even to those weird attitudes about bullying itself.
Exactly. And some of those findings really challenge common assumptions, don't they?
Definitely. Like relational and verbal harm potentially hitting harder on well-being than physical harm. That's huge. And that pro-bully paradox.
These insights really push us to ask, are our current efforts truly focused on the most damaging aspects? Maybe interventions need to get much better at tackling relational aggression, the subtle stuff, the verbal attacks.
Yeah, perhaps broadening the focus beyond just physical bullying, which often gets the most attention in policies. And we need to figure out how to handle that pro-bully paradox so we don't inadvertently make things worse for physically victimized kids.
And that last point about national policies.
Hmm.
It's not that policies are bad, but it highlights we need more research on what makes a policy effective in practice. What happens at the school level? How do we ensure implementation works?
Right. It's not just about having the policy, it's about making it live.
Exactly.
So, look, we've covered a lot, but it really feels like just scratching the surface of this complex issue. Which leaves us with a final thought for everyone listening. Given everything we've discussed, the potentially greater harm of relational and verbal stuff, the cross-cultural complexities, that pro-bully paradox, how might we need to fundamentally rethink how we foster positive peer relationships? How do we prevent harm not just in school hallways, but online too?
And what about bystanders? We haven't talked much about them, but what's their role? How can we empower them effectively to actually step in and make things better?
Lots to think about. We really encourage you to look into this more if you're interested. The original article, related research, there's clearly so much more to understand here.